whatever you like. That's Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Delighted to be here with Maaza Mengiste, who's for an event on casting a new light in colonial history, an Ethiopian epic. We'll be discussing her most recent novel, The Shadow King, today. And I'm thinking about the opening talk by Lauren Groff, where she mentioned having just completed a historical novel, or in fact, I think she's embarking on a trilogy of historical novels. She mentioned her aversion to historical novels and the fact that novelists, that it's seen as perhaps an inferior form. And maybe before we begin to speak in detail about this work of fiction in particular, could you say something about perhaps what, as a novelist, do you see as what's the risk, what's the pitfall, what could be an aversion to writing historical fiction as opposed to something that is merely imaginary or contemporary?
Oh. I love historical fiction so much that I have a hard time thinking of what a pitfall could be. This is a really interesting question. First, let me say that it is such a pleasure to be here. Thank you all. And really, to be in conversation with you again, Daniel, is a gift. I think the pitfall for me with historical fiction is that what actually happened often is more spectacular and more stupendous than fiction. There are things that I cannot make up. There are human beings who existed that if I were to write them as fictional characters, no one would believe that they existed. And so the trick for me becomes, how do I make something that really happened feel believable? And I've come across this again and again and again in my writings and in my research. Different military generals, commanders from different countries that I would like to put into fiction are grander than fiction. They are more fictional than anything I could create. And to put them in would completely erase all, I think, believability I have. So for me, it's how do I temper everything that actually has happened so that fiction can contain it, because usually truth is much, much stranger than what we make up.
And vis-a-vis that containment, can you tell me what you find attractive about historical fiction, in the sense that these last two novels both deal in some way with Haile Selassie at different points in time. Obviously, you've wanted to write, he's a character, he appears in this novel at different interludes, different moments, different scenes, and so you are writing actual figures, and you're writing about specific events, and clearly there's research behind it. If you mentioned one of the challenges, could you say what has drawn you to working not out of just something that might be contextual or a family where it's invented within a historical context, but to the point where you're actually entering real scenarios, real occasions, writing about people who, well, the Emperor of Ethiopia.
Well, I have to say it took about 4 drafts of Beneath the Lion's Gaze, my first novel, before I could even think about approaching the emperor. I could not do it because he felt like something much larger than life. He had created so many legends and myths about himself that I didn't know how to approach him. What attracts me to historical fiction, what attracts me to writing these moments, particularly from my first novel, which dealt in 1974 during a revolution in Ethiopia, is that event, I had memories of those moments, those early days in the revolution that felt gigantic in my head. It was much too large for a little girl to understand, and as I became an adult, I had no words to describe my own memories. Fiction helps me quite literally start to compartmentalize, and then from that begin to draw out certain moments and develop them, ask myself questions along the way, and make it about someone besides just myself. Historical fiction allows me to create order it helps me create order so that I know the kinds of questions I want to ask. But it doesn't give me the answers. What it does is help me complicate the questions. So that what I've realized is that each book that I begin to do, each essay that I write, every lecture that I give, it's about the questions that lead me from one to the other, so that an essay that I might write is helping answer a question or develop a question that I had in a book. So this thread keeps moving, but I can do it in historical fiction, partly because history interests me. And I think I can do it because history gives me parameters. And that's really, for me, it's fun to work with that. It's as if someone gives you something. We were talking about labyrinths, right? Lauren was talking about labyrinths in her talk the other night. And it's as if someone sets me in a labyrinth and says, now find your way out. But actually what I can do is create my own paths within that. And I find that it's fun as much as something enriching.
It's quite funny because I think associatively, given that one of the last events just featured a member of the Ulipo, that, a constraint, right? The historical constraints and framework that you're given to work with. But within that space, there's all the room in the world to create something. I want to go back to this historical material. I don't know, maybe this is a difficult question to answer, but one of the things that I've been struck by, certainly about different historical periods, and this has been my reading for a previous event, which also involved storytelling about and speculation about different moments in history that are lesser known and that have been recorded less well, is that, when we look back on things that have happened, you have the certainty of the present on reflecting upon the past, right? So for example, if Monika Schneiderman is talking about the pre-war life of her Jewish family, we as readers today know what the fate of that family will largely be. We will know the outcomes of things. It's much more difficult to enter the minds and the uncertainty of those people living in the present who are photographed in 1931, in 1932. I wonder whether maybe you can speak about, because this also feels like the work of fiction is to imagine and to enter that sense of the present of a previous time, of a previous place, of previous, it's a different world in many cases, different languages. Because that feels as though in The Shadow King, which covers a large swathe of time, but is very centered on the invasion of Ethiopia under the command of Mussolini. How, I suppose, do you recreate, this feels like a fiction workshop question, but against the sense of the present in a moment in which, the reader already knows what will happen? How do you fully enter? How do you discard your own knowledge while trying to imagine or create on the page somebody who doesn't possess that knowledge of what's going to happen?
So I'm going to go back to the labyrinth because I think that's a really interesting concept, and it's a really good metaphor to think about the work of a historical novelist. I know when, for example, The Shadow King is set during Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, which was in 1935, and the war ended in 1941. So in essence, we have the beginning of the labyrinth. We know when that is, and we know when the end is. But everything that happens in the middle is really is the subject of fiction. It's not that the character goes from point A to point B. It's how did it feel through every turn, through every obstacle? Who did they meet along the way? What were the fears? I could write characters that were brave, but there's no bravery without terror and fear. And that becomes then more ground for me to develop. And I find that, again, that containment. But within that, there are all these uncertainties inside that I can begin to play around with and develop. And it's interesting to think about this moment, 1935, fascist Italy deciding that they were going to invade a sovereign nation, as something that is little known. And yet, when Mussolini was preparing to invade Ethiopia in 1935, everything leading up to the war and everything after the invasion into 1936 was on the front pages of every newspaper around the world. So that the anti-apartheid newspapers in South Africa had that on their front pages, as well as newspapers in Austria, as well as Germany, as well as England, as well as everywhere. It was well known. And then at some point, Hitler invades Poland, and that's it. Ethiopia moves to the back of the page. The question then becomes not was it well known, but why was it forgotten? And I think here we have this, we know what would come afterwards. We know that World War II came, but this war was called the first real war of World War II. Everything that happened in Ethiopia dictated how the Axis and the Allied forces would group and who would fight for who and against whom. And I find these details really interesting to think about today. Thinking about the war in Ukraine, thinking about an authoritarian nation invading a sovereign country, thinking about the way that the bravery, those moments of bravery that we witnessed in Ukraine in those first few weeks and months of battle, for me, mirrored 100% those moments of bravery in Ethiopia, of Ethiopians racing against tanks with nothing but spears, standing in front of charging forces with nothing, because they figured that the guns would eventually get hot and the Italians would have to stop. So I hear these echoes today of what's happening in the past. The danger is trying to make it fit perfectly. It doesn't. But Ethiopia is forgotten, but it was not ignored back then. And it makes me wonder, 30, 40 years from now, the kinds of conversations we will be having about Ukraine.
I can't help thinking about, if we're dealing with in memory and documentation about photography. And one of the principal characters in this novel is a photographer. And I wonder if you could say something about why you wanted not just photographs as important aspects of the novel. And I suspect, well, actually, I know some of this must be based on documentary research because there are 2 photographs in the novel. This occurs to me as I ask the question. But you also wanted one of the characters to be a photographer as well. Mm-hmm. And can you say why that was important to you?
There are 2 ways I can answer this question, Daniel. One is a long way with a story, or another is a quite succinct way. Do you have a preference?
Doesn't everybody like stories?
All right. I was living in Italy. I was doing research in the archives, in the fascist archives in Rome, moving through document after document, newspapers, telegrams, all of this, and coming across a kind of war that was a curated memory by Mussolini. This is what the fascists saved. This is what they censored. This is what was in the archives. This is what I was reading. And I knew that there was more to this history. It wasn't there in front of me. And at one point, I was touring through Italy for my first novel, set in 1974 during a communist revolution in Ethiopia. And I went to the southern part of Italy, to Calabria. Calabria is in the south, was where a lot of the foot soldiers in Italy came from. Officers tended to come from the more industrialized, richer north, where they had education, they could go to military schools, but the people who actually fought on the ground were from the south, in general. The poorer nations, countries, regions. So I wondered when I was in Calabria whether I would encounter any part of this memory of 1935. And I was in a really tiny bookstore, and we talked about my first novel. And when it came time for Q&A, a man stood up, and he said, "I would like to talk about 1935." And the entire room went quiet. And I could hear certain people go, "Madai, sit down, enough, basta." And he said, "I want to talk about this." And he starts getting emotional. His voice is starting to shake. He said, "My father was a pilot during this war." And he started to cry. And he said, "He dropped the poison gas on your people. How do I ask for your forgiveness?" And he could barely stand at that point. And I was overcome by the emotion. The room was incredibly tense. And I said something to the effect of, having a conversation is a way towards a kind of understanding. And he said to me, "Please, please don't leave. I'll be right back." He runs out. We continue this Q&A. He comes back a little bit later with a self-published copy of a book. And it was his father's journal entries, his father's letters home, his father's photographs. And he gave it to me, and he said, "This is for you. Do what you want with it." So I went back to my apartment in Rome and started looking through it, and it was the photographs that really arrested me. In it, I saw a young man from a small town who had never traveled very far from his little village. So Africa was his big adventure in life. This was the furthest he would probably ever get from home. He went and participated in this brutality, made jokes about the brutality, enjoyed it, it seemed. And at the same time, he was loved. And at the same time, he loved. He came back a kind of man that I realized his son would never understand. That son, when his father came back, didn't know who his father was anymore. That war had created a gap and a bridge like a gap between them, I don't think ever was fixed. He told me later that his father had never spoken about his time in Ethiopia, kept everything in a box that he kept locked in a closet. And it wasn't until his father died that this man opened this thing and an entire other history came. And he never quite got along with his father. He couldn't understand this thing that was inside him that I now understand was Ethiopia. And I wondered about photography, about what it might be able to tell me about this war, because the photos from this man revealed both the innocence and brutality, the compassion and the cruelties, the friendships and the complete murderousness of what it means to be at war. And I knew that Mussolini wanted to use photographs as a weapon. He wanted journalists to go before the war began and photograph Africans, photograph people who looked like me, so that he could create an image of us so to show the Italians that we needed to be civilized, that we were barbaric, that we were stupid, that we could not read Homer, we could not understand Aristotle, we could not tell stories. If he could wipe out our imaginative powers, then he could make us into beasts through photographs. So I thought, I cannot do this book without incorporating one of the strongest and most powerful weapons in war, which is photography. But I didn't want to recreate those photographs in an image. I didn't want to put those things in there. What I needed to do was control them myself and begin to look at them in my own way and project them back in the best way that I could. There are 2 photographs in here, but the rest of the photographs are word images. I recreated the photographs through words, but from the perspective often of the subjects, so that they're looking at the camera and speaking back to history. But it was thanks to this encounter that I had in Calabria with this man that I began to think about how to use those photographs for a different purpose than what they were intended.
Maybe it would be possible to read a passage from the novel in which a shooting takes place, not the shooting of the war, but actual. Would you like to introduce the context for this scene?
Sure. One of my characters in this novel, the one that you mentioned, Ettore, is Italian, and he's also Jewish. He has brought his camera to war. He has been ordered by Colonel Fucelli, his commanding officer, to photograph atrocities, but also to photograph these Ethiopian women who are rumored to be in an army, and it's terrifying these Italian men. And Fucelli imagines that if you photograph these women, photograph them nude, the men will have nothing to be afraid of because they will see that they're just women.
Turns them into Achilles.
And these photographs will turn these men into Achilles, remind them of who they are. At this point in the story, there is also a census going through the military in Italy and across Italy. It's the beginning of the anti-Semitic laws that will take effect. And everyone in the military is required to fill out the census that talks about, that details who their parents were, grandparents, and so on. And this is a way for the government to figure out who is Jewish and who is Aryan. The Italians were calling themselves Aryan at that point. So I think there is a census mentioned in here, and that's what that's referring to. To die, he finally thinks to say on the 8th day. Ettore has been trying to photograph Hirut, who is resisting. To die, he finally thinks to say on the 8th day. He repeats the word again in Amharic, then Italian, to die, mammot, morire. He notices her hands tremble slightly on her lap. He goes on, I die, you die, we die, they die. Hirut, he says. They die, he repeats. They will die. Yemotallo. He feels his chest constrict. A space flickers open between them, and even though she still refuses to turn in his direction, he sees how the words unwind something inside her that she struggles to keep contained. He sits straighter, tries to keep focused, to keep thoughts of the senses away. Mail is arriving in a few days. Ettore raises his camera, leans back, and snaps a picture of her profile. Those wet eyes, the sun glowing in a lush horizon that will be faded to black and white on film. He waits for her to move, to wave him aside so she can be alone. He marvels momentarily at her discipline, that military rigidity that could rival any soldier's. She blinks her eyes dry. She presses her back more firmly against the wall. She brings her knees to her chest and wraps her arms around them. Then she goes back to that unnerving, stubborn stillness. He is not sure why he takes out the photograph of his parents on their wedding day. He keeps it next to Leo's letter as if one offers a clue into the other. In the picture, his father is stern and somber in his black suit and crisp white shirt. He looks as if he is on his way to university, as if his time in the photo studio is a temporary pause in an otherwise busy day. Gabriella is dressed in a delicate white dress, the lace trim around her neck and wrists, a tender spray across slender bones. Her dress drops elegantly at her waist and stops low on her slim frame. She is seated in a chair, back straight, chin ducked demurely, her eyes trailing to the side to catch a glimpse of her new husband. Leo leans one hand on the back of the chair as if it is support that he needs, as if he has come from a long journey, and even on this day, his wedding day, he is tired. His father, Ettore notices for the first time, is much older than the 4 years they have always claimed stood between them. Looking at it now, he also sees his mother as a slightly startled, eager young woman, somewhat in love, but more perplexed. His father is stoic and dutiful, and there is a haggardness around his eyes that lends him the air of a tortured poet. Ettore repeats the words again, softly almost to himself. To die. Mammot. She looks down at the picture, then at him. Then she grips her hands together and stares at the photo again. He feels the tension in her, how she coils into herself. So he points at his father and decides to confess in Italian the most truthful thing he can, because she will never understand. This is how I hold my father still. This is how I stare at him without having to answer his questions. Ettore wants to add in Amharic, my parents could be dead. They might not be dead. But he is stopped short by vocabulary, by the conditional tense, by that way of speaking that shifts everything into the hypothetical, into an imagined existence that could or could not be true. Everything is possible at once. I could die. He could be dead. She might have died. We might die together.
Thank you. So I think this has also been a theme of several of the talks today, is the things that happen off stage in history, or the things that are invisible to the record in many cases. And maybe we can talk now about the subject of these photographs. There's the representation of women over the course of this war and their role in the war. Both of these things are happening simultaneously in the novel, so that you have, on the one hand, as a reader, it's quite exciting because you have something that feels like a domestic drama, which is very distilled, almost like a Bergman film, where you have a small group of characters and their interactions over time and the tensions between them. Yet it's against an epic canvas. And I think that for many people, well, I'd be curious as to, like, where did you find a lot of this information? Because I don't think it's purely intuition and invention about the place that women, the role that they had over the course of this war as active participants, in the same way that these two prisoners have become involved in the war.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. It was really difficult to find information, to find written information about women in Ethiopia in the war in 1935. I could find oral history. There were, of course, stories that some would trickle down over the decades, but those stories often told of women who were cooks in the homes of Italians or their companions and would spy. And so women were still in this domestic role, not necessarily on the front lines. But I knew that they existed because I had happened to stumble across some photographs of Ethiopian women in uniform with their rifles. And the first time I came across it, I think I might have screamed in the library. No one told me about this. And it completely changed the book. I went back and I said, all right, sorry, men, but we're about to start another book. And I redid this whole book, but I realized I don't have a lot of information. Ethiopians were marching during war. They didn't have journalists necessarily within their camps writing down all of the details. Mussolini had them. What would I do? So I started looking at liberation movements around the world, anti-colonial movements across Africa, across Asia, looking at the roles of women in these movements. And women were always front and center. Women were always in the front. Spanish Civil War, women were fighting. The anti-partisans, the partigiani in Italy, the women were there. We could keep moving forward into Vietnam, China, Ukraine. Cuba. Women were there. So somehow, something kept happening in history where every time a woman appeared in war, it was almost as if it was the first time a woman had ever been in war. We keep forgetting the thousands that came before her. I have my own theories, but the first recorded written record of a woman in war, I believe, is 1200 BC. Penthesilea fought against Achilles and fought so well that as he was killing her, he wept. Homer didn't make up a woman in war. He was taking from what actually existed and creating this epic poem from those experiences. So I knew women were there, but I had to go and research all of these other women to figure out what it meant to be a woman at war in Ethiopia. The experiences of women are not as unique or as isolated as we would like to think. What I began to realize in looking across the centuries and across countries was that women have always been considered territory to conquer, just like land. What the soldier does when you go into a village, you take the land, but to really conquer a community, you need to take the women, Because if you take the woman, you have destroyed this other thing about men. You've destroyed a community, and you have destroyed the generations that will come after. If the children born are part of you, that community will never be stable again. So the women become trophy and territory, as well as soldier. But I started thinking about, in these kinds of communities, or in these kinds of societies that are patriarchal, when a woman fights next to a man as a soldier, and a soldier enters an army, enters a military as a sign of manhood, this is what men do. If war makes a man out of you, what happens when a woman is fighting next to you? What does that say about your manhood? If a woman is charging at you, what does that say about your manhood? How do you begin to prove your manhood if you don't prove it once you're off the battlefield? So women were soldiers when they were in the front lines. But when they went back to the camps, they became women again, with all of the complications that that entailed. Women who are in military or in liberation movements often don't talk about that. Sometimes, for women revolutionaries, for women who are radicalized in whatever way, it's less important to fight for their own right than to fight for a belief.
The cause.
Sometimes, for women, fighting for themselves is as if they are fighting for a country. In my novel, Hirut, who is a soldier who is forced to not only fight in the front lines, but has to protect herself back in the military camp against the sexual advances of her commanding officer, has to think about what she will do. For Hirut, the question becomes, isn't a girl worth more than a country? Aren't I my own country? And so she begins to question who the enemy really is, and maybe she has more than one.
I want to ask a question about, not even a question, just a request for you to tell the audience about the origin of the title. So the Shadow King, Le Roi Fantôme. Yeah. Partly this involves Hirut and her role. Partly it's also related to this conversation about the epic form. You're talking about Homer and Achilles. This is, I'm thinking of the character of Minim, and maybe you could just say something about the title and what he represents in the novel, or even simply what he does, because this is absolutely fascinating and fun to read.
So the title has many echoes throughout the book, but one of them is this character that is named Minim. Minim in Amharic means nothing. And did I name him that, or did his mother name him that? I had his mother name him that because when he was born, his mother said, now there is nothing else that I could ever want. So he's called nothing. But Minim also happens to look eerily like the emperor, Haile Selassie. He is just a villager. He is a peasant. He, at heart, is a musician. He's not a fighter at all. But when Haile Selassie flees and goes to the UK, it is the first time in Ethiopian history that an emperor leaves his people during a war. In Ethiopian military warfare, the old style, not modern warfare, but the old style, the way in the West, most commanders are off on a hill somewhere and they're radioing in whatever their commands are. In Ethiopia, the leaders of the military are the first in the front rows. They charge and lead the men. So if you're an officer, you're there, you're prepared to die. When Haile Selassie left, the army didn't know what to do. this was the first time this had ever happened. Minim, poor Minim, looks exactly like the emperor. He doesn't want to do it, but they make him dress up in the clothes of the emperor and start to galvanize people again to fight. So he becomes the Shadow King. But also in the book for me, the Shadow King becomes all these women who rise up to replace a king who left the country. It came from questions about partly what makes a leader, but also some very real questions about the fact that not every, but so many world leaders, maybe the more dictatorial you are, the more likely you are to have a doppelganger. Hitler had some, Mussolini had at least 5, Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi. I've heard rumors of Putin having some. Melania, fake Melania. I just thought this would be an interesting device to do. But partly I was thinking about what makes a leader, and if someone who is called nothing could really take the place of an emperor, then what is an emperor? And what does it take to lead a nation? And Minim was really fun to work with.
I'm going to indulge myself with one last question before we turn things over to the audience, because I'm sure they'll want to ask you things about the novel as well. And this has to do with the reception of the novel. It's a work of fiction, but it's one that draws on experiences that have involved 2 different countries. And so, of course, I'm curious about, the way, and it's been translated, for example, into Italian. And I suppose there are 2 kinds of categories that I'm curious about. On the one hand, how has it been received by Italy and other countries that have a colonial history as colonizer? Because there will be parallels. They won't be exact, but there's going to be some form of reflection. And then I'm curious as to how it might have been received in Ethiopia or other countries that have experienced this form of, or a variant of this kind of colonization.
The book was published in Italy and translated by Anna Nadotti. And Anna and I have had conversations for a number of years before she was translating this. And we spoke many times over the course of this translation. So I knew that the book was in really good hands and it was being very well cared for. When the book was released in Italy, I think it sent shockwaves in many ways. A lot of people didn't know about this history because it wasn't taught in history books. If there was anything in, let's say, a textbook for high school, it could be Mussolini went to East Africa, went to Ethiopia, and then in 41 came back, and that was it. I had friends of mine whose family members had fought in Ethiopia who told me that when their grandfather, when their uncle, whenever any of those relatives came back, no one talked about it. One of my friends said, Ethiopia was a wall in our family. It just was never said. The word was never said. So this book helped to continue conversations about this period. But I'm not the first person to write about this in Italy. Ijaba Shago, Cristina Uba, Farah Ali, Gabriella Germandi. There are people in Italy who have been writing from their own perspectives about this. So the book has been very lucky to follow the paths that they have opened. And now the book joins in conversation with them, these women that I feel very lucky to call my friends. In Ethiopia, and I would get emails from readers who said, I had no idea that this was happening in Ethiopia. There were only stories of bravery that were told, none of the brutalities, none of the humiliations that happen in war. When Italy left, Haile Selassie came back and said, we're not going to talk about what happened. We're not going to blame our Italian brothers. It was Mussolini who did this, but not the Italians, who many of them wanted to stay in Ethiopia. They did not want to go back to Italy. And so there was now a population of Italians, and he said, we need to welcome them as our brothers. So there was no conversation.
Stays, actually,
and Ettore
right?
stays. He's an example. And so there was no reckoning. There was nothing. And generations grew up never understanding what happened. Italy never apologized for any of the war crimes committed. It wasn't until '96 that they even admitted they dropped poison gas. So there is still a conversation that needs to happen that hasn't. But when you asked about people from across maybe different countries in Africa or different countries that have been colonized, when they read it, I think that those countries recognize that fight for liberation. But this is one story in a history of a country that has many different stories. I'm writing about Ethiopia fighting against a colonial power, and yet within Ethiopia, within imperial Ethiopia, there were also their own acts of colonization against different ethnic groups. There's no country that's innocent. And those are still stories that need to come out. I mentioned a little bit in here about some of the people in the book that say the Italians have got to be better than Haile Selassie and all these people who are trying to dominate and rule us. And that is a reality that Ethiopia is still reckoning with today. The war that we have seen break out has been a war that's been in existence since before 1935.
Thank you so much. If anyone has a question, please remember to speak into the microphone so that the interpreters can hear you. Yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. What about your next book? What will be the subject?
Oh. Oh my God. I'm supposed to say I don't know, but I do know. Let me just say, I'm in the relatively early stages of it. It is historical fiction again. I swore when I was in the middle of The Shadow King I would never do another thing where I had to research, but I'm back at it again. I like this territory. I've moved a little bit out of Ethiopia, and I am in Germany, 1920s. That's all I'm going to say. Nobody else asked me anything else about this book.
Hello. Thank you. I came here because I was very interested about the subject, writing as a woman, Ethiopian, about the colonists coming to your country. Because my mother was born in Libya when it was colonized by Italian, and she was when the World War. I mean, when Mussolini declared the war, 1940. She was 6 years old. So I wrote, just now I finished a manuscript about her life, because he took 15,000 children, all from the colonies, and he brought them to Italy, and he spread them in 50 different camp, and they became fascist camps. So he brainwashed all these children, and yeah, it's very interesting. I don't have a question, but I went also to the archives fascist archives in Roma to look for information. So, but it was told, of course, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, they were all colonized.
Yeah. What Mussolini
Sorry, my
did,
mother, she's still alive. She's 89 years old.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
yeah.
Thank you for writing that story. Everything that the Italians did in Ethiopia, they did first in Libya. They practiced in Libya. Yeah. It was one of the most brutal campaigns, but it was called a pacification campaign. Concentration camps, mustard gas, complete annihilation of villages of women and children and the elderly were practiced in Libya before the camps were built in Ethiopia and Somalia. That history is, again, not very spoken of very much, but it's, Gaddafi, in fact, came to power just talking about that history.
Yeah, there were 20,000 Italians still in Libya when he came to power.
Yes.
But like my grandmother in Libya, she was teaching Italian to the Libyans. And my grandfather, he was a police officer, but all the other Italians, they were farmers.
Farmer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oui, je vais poser ma question en français. Par rapport à cet échange que vous avez eu avec cet homme en Calabre, je voulais comprendre quelle place ou quel rôle pourrait avoir le pardon dans votre livre.
I question forgiveness in the book. I don't know what it means. Two of my characters, one Italian, one Ethiopian, meet 40 years after the war. The Italian would like to imagine that he has earned forgiveness because he feels so bad. And the Ethiopian says, what do you want me to forget in order to forgive you? Do you understand how much I have lost? What are you asking? What more do you want of me, in this forgiveness? I think forgiveness requires a reckoning first. It requires justice first. And then there can be some conversation about forgiveness, but it hasn't happened in Ethiopia. And until then, I think you have to have justice first before any kind of forgiveness can happen. And I think we can recognize that in this situation between Ukraine and Russia. 10, 20, 30 years later, you can't speak of forgiveness until there's a reckoning.
Merci, tout ce que vous avez dit, c'était passionnant, j'ai appris beaucoup de choses. Comment est-ce que vous expliquez ce silence par rapport à la guerre en Éthiopie? Je ne comprends pas, parce que dans d'autres cas, on parlait, et là, pourquoi il y a eu un tel silence chez les gens qui avaient fait la guerre ou officiellement? Merci.
In 1935, oui, am I understanding? Oui. I think Ethiopia by 1941 wanted to rebuild. I think that was Haile Selassie wanted just to rebuild. Let's pick up where we left off in 35. Let us forget about this trauma, or at least let the families and individuals deal with it. But as a nation, we are going to move forward. We're going to build buildings, build hospitals, build schools, work with the Italians that have come in, and let's move forward. Ethiopia did not and does not have a tradition of sitting down and beginning to speak of traumatic events. It's a nation that has taken so much pride in being courageous and brave and being anti-colonial fighters, that to begin to speak of the real devastations and catastrophes and personal pains of war is to reveal a weakness, and in some ways to reveal defeat in some way. And so it just doesn't happen. I wish it did. Italy never had it either. Italy never reckoned with what they did in Libya and what they did in East Africa. And what we are seeing now with this far-right government that has taken power is a distortion of that history to praise Mussolini without remembering that fascism came back into Italy and began to destroy Italians as well. That's because they never spoke about that war or those wars in Libya and Ethiopia. I think what we have is a country that can't even, there's no vocabulary to begin to talk about its racisms. And now this far right wants to wipe it all out.
I think this will be one last question.
Okay. It's a question about your next book.
No.
Just kidding, just kidding. No, about what you just said, I've read a book by Francesca Melandri where she weaves the memories of this forgotten war, forbidden war in a way, and the immigration crisis. You've talked about the current government and how this untold history is coloring this government, but what about immigrants and in Italy and the whole relationship with, you know, the Mediterranean boats, etc.?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The way that immigrants are being depicted, the way that they are thought of, the way that they are spoken to and spoken about comes from a lack of conversation about how racist Italy was even in 1935. The one thing that I have been continually appreciative of and so thankful of is the liberatory fights against colonialism that happened across Africa. The anti-racist activism that continues to happen in the United States and around the world, that have given a vocabulary, that have named that disease that is racism and said, these are the words and these are the ways that people think that's racist. That's, you name it and you begin to recognize it, you begin to find another vocabulary for it. You begin to heal inside. Imagine a country that's never had that. And you can imagine the way that people who don't fit a certain type are then treated and spoken about. And I think there's a direct connection between the past and what's happened in the Mediterranean.
Thank you so much for these questions. Maaza will be upstairs to answer any additional questions. One more? There's time? Okay.
Je peux encore en poser une. Donc, j'espère que la réponse ne sera pas trop longue. Je vous remercie déjà pour vos propos et pour nous avoir surtout parlé du rôle des femmes combattantes qui sont un peu trop souvent oubliées. Et par rapport à ce que vous avez dit, j'aurais été intéressée, disons de votre part, d'essayer d'avancer dans l'idée suivante. Ça m'est arrivé que ce soit des anciennes combattantes de l'Algérie, que ce soit les combattantes aujourd'hui de Palestine, d'être toujours frappée entre le rôle qu'elles occupent dans les combats, et très souvent au premier plan, et en même temps ce retour dans leur foyer où elles vont retrouver la tradition en quelque sorte. Et donc, j'ai toujours été frappée de voir que dans, en quelque sorte, le maintien du foyer familial avec toutes ces traditions, elles y étaient aussi présentes. Je veux dire, elles ont quand même ce double rôle d'être combattantes au front, mais aussi quelque part d'être gardiennes des traditions. Et donc, qui peut nous apparaître peut-être à nous, occidentales, comme une régression, alors qu'elles se trouvent aussi actives dans ce maintien, puisque c'est dans leur culture qu'elles sont attaquées. Et donc, c'est la préservation de leur propre culture qui en fait aussi un combat.
Yes, I think so. I don't think it's one or the other. If I'm understanding the question correctly, I think women did not change the world when they came back from war. They exposed themselves to other possibilities of what they could be, but they came back into a system that was essentially preserved. My great-grandmother enlisted in this war in 1935. When she came back from the war, she went back to being somebody's wife, but she didn't like her husband. She didn't like him before the war. She really didn't like him after the war. She divorced him. And I think that might have been maybe that revolutionary act of changing her world by the time she came back. She understood something, and she could leave him and find another man that she wanted to marry. Yeah, so I think women would go back, but that being in a home and working, raising a family is not necessarily a narrow world either. It has so many possibilities. A woman can choose how she will raise her children and how she will develop and complicate the relationships that she has within her community and in her marriage. I don't find it a limiting role. So I would like to think that those women came back and continued to be fighters in their own ways.
Thank you so much, Maaza.
Thank you. Thank you.